Joining us now, Jon Hartley, an economic policy analyst and writer. Jon, a lot of people seem confused in the United States because they think, oh my goodness, we don't want to have socialism. We already do have socialism in some aspects, whether it's our transportation systems, our subway systems, the wall President Trump wants to build along the southern border. Well,
that's exactly right. I think there are some socialistic elements already in the U.S. economy. I think what these labels of socialist, capitalist, these are just labels. At the end of the day, it's a question of individual economic freedom and how much we want to have. On the one end of it, with maximum voluntary exchange that's relatively uninhibited, you could call that free market capitalism, and on the other, where the state controls the means of production, you could call that socialism. I think that fundamentally, OAC doesn't fully, understand what socialism necessarily is. You have many examples in Europe where maybe one sector of the economy, for example, healthcare, is socialized, but many other elements of the economy are still market-based. This is the case in the Nordics and many other European countries, as well as Canada over here in the Western Hemisphere. But every time you look at socialism in its purest form, where many sectors have been socialized, ultimately, there's never been a case where you have not ended up in economic catastrophe, whether it's the USSR, more recently in Venezuela. So I think at the end of the day, these are just labels, and it's a question of how much economic freedom we want to have. And I think at some level, there's a tipping point where it becomes, a very dangerous question of how much economic freedom they want to take away.
President Trump mentioned socialism as the reason for the poor, dire state of Venezuela, and he uses Venezuela as an example to fight radical leftist voices, calling to adopt the socialist system in this country. But these voices would say socialism is not the problem, corruption is the problem, or an evil regime is the problem. What's your thought on this debate?
Well, that argument, I think, is a false one. I think Venezuela has absolutely adopted a socialist system. You look at what they've done since they've adopted what's called Bolivarian socialism. This was when Hugo Chavez came to power in the 2000s. What they effectively did was they nationalized almost every sector, including autos, energy, financials, industrials. And to pay for this, they ultimately couldn't borrow anymore, to the point where they started printing money, and this is what led to hyperinflation. And so I think at the end of the day, that is what socialism is at its purest
But there are
form.
other countries in the region. I mean, I believe Bolivia, Uruguay, you could look at countries in Europe that have also followed that sort of socialist route and have not had the same problems.
Well, I think they haven't necessarily gone to the same extremes where, for example, they have prevented any sort of U.S. dollar-denominated imports, which ultimately, or on top of that, establishing price controls and creating food shortages. And that's what's led to a lot of the hunger and starvation that you're seeing.
But my argument is that because you have other countries that have followed a socialist model, it does seem to underscore that corruption certainly is a part of it. If you had the same level of corruption in, say, the Nordic countries that you have in Venezuela, one could predict that you would have the same problems.
Well, I think ultimately both socialism and corruption go hand in hand, taken to a certain extreme. I think you couldn't look at a certain country that had such governmental control where you didn't have some form of socialism. You've seen that in the USSR, you see that in Venezuela.
But Nordic countries like Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland even, they're always given as an example for a good type of socialism, but they're also countries very highly ranked in every economic index of freedom and ease of doing business. So how does it sit together?
Well, I think it's funny how Denmark came out, I think, over the past few weeks and said, well, actually, we're not a socialist country. Should they have single-payer health care, and they have a socialized healthcare sector, but they still have a liberal financial sector. They have most of their economy is still market-based. And so I think, again, this is just coming back to labels. How much economic freedom do you want to have? And I think these countries, the Nordics, still have a high degree of economic freedom, and which is a large part of why they're still successful economically.
Jon Hartley, an economist, policy analyst, and writer. Jon, thanks so much for coming in. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.